So today we're talking about mechanisms for evolution. There's three main points that we need to understand here. The first is that populations evolve and not the individual. A population is the smallest unit of evolution.
And so let's talk about what that actually looks like. A single individual cannot evolve. And you don't have this picture in your notes, but it's a really valuable picture here because even though it shows you the physical appearance of the organism, it's also kind of showing you its DNA and the versions of its DNA. So if we go back and we think back to what it means to be dominant, here brown is dominant, and you have some heterozygotes and some homozygous. And so what we have to be careful with is an individual does not change their DNA. And natural selection is really not working on acquired traits. So if you dye your hair or if you get a suntan, those are acquired traits. Or we even talked about plucking the wings off of a cricket. That is kind of an acquired trait. And you can't pass that on to your offspring. So it's actually inherited traits. And so we want to really take the time to remember that it's really only traits that you inherit that natural selection and evolution have an impact on. Because evolution, remember, is change, and you can write the triangle for delta. Delta equals change over generations. And that means that all has to do with what you pass on. So if evolution is going to occur, it's going to occur in a whole population, not in a single individual. And that's because different versions are passed on as organisms reproduce.
Okay, so the second are changes in the gene pool. Changes in the gene pool can occur because of mutations, and mutations are changes in the DNA of an organism. And you have to think about, does this change affect the phenotype?
Okay, so if we remember that not all mutations are actually going to show up in the physical appearance, sometimes the mutation has absolutely no effect. So you can have lots of mutations and no phenotype change. Remember, the phenotype is the trait that helps you survive. Helps you survive. And so the way that we're going to measure evolution is we're going to look for changes in the gene pool. So we're actually going to measure changes in the gene pool. And that's one way that we know evolution is happening. Because sometimes you can be looking at organisms and not tell that they have evolved until you actually study the genes.
So the second mechanism, you have environmental changes that can occur, and there are three types of natural selection that will occur here. So the first is disruptive selection, where conditions are most favorable for both of the two extremes of your phenotype.
And so what we want to kind of keep in mind here is this idea that we can have a change in the gene pool, but we still need an environmental change to be the selection force. So if we think back to the example of the rabbits and the wolves, you had changes in the gene pool. You had dark rabbits and white rabbits, but it didn't matter until there was a selection force, until the predator was there, and then until the environment changed. So we need to see changes in the gene pool and changes in the environment, and that will produce natural selection that comes in these three types. Or we're just going to add in the word pattern real quickly, because sometimes we'll see patterns.
So the second would be stabilizing selection, and this is where conditions are most favorable for the average version of the phenotype. And then you have directional selection, where conditions are most favorable for one of the two extremes, so either or.
And so you might need to pause the video at this point if you need a little bit more time writing. But we're going to go ahead and look at an example of this, because sometimes it makes a little bit more sense when you see a picture. One thing I do want to kind of add in is just to look at the word. Disrupt might mean to separate. To disrupt a crowd would be to divide into two. Stabilize, if you're really stable, if you're in the middle, and directional is one way or the other. So if we look at these graphs, it actually kind of gives us a visual aid. The red is showing the before and the blue is showing the after. So if you look in each of these, we kind of see this initial trend of a bell curve. But in this first population, something happens, and afterwards, it's not good to be this middle color. And so this one is disruptive selection. Whatever changed in the environment meant that this middle color was at a disadvantage, and these two were selected for, and so that is disruptive.
With stabilizing selection, you have your before, again, that bell curve, but here you have that middle phenotype being selected for and being the one that survives.
And so we kind of see the graph kind of inching more and more towards the center to be on the middle end and to be kind of more stable. So there must be something wrong with being a really long lizard, and something wrong with being a really short lizard, and you want to be an average lizard. And you should be able to make a suggestion about why. So some of you, when you looked at the crickets, you're able to say, oh, if you're a really big cricket, then you can't hide very well. But if you're a really small cricket, then you can't compete for food. So it would probably be best to be right in the middle. And so you should be able to make predictions about why each of these curves might occur. The last one is actually kind of looking at giraffes, and the pattern here is a little different. In the beginning, it was an advantage to be a short, but something in the environment changed, and the whole population shifted. Now keep in mind, this doesn't mean a short giraffe can change into a tall or long-necked giraffe. It means any short giraffes are probably going to die. Medium giraffes have a slightly better chance of survival, and the best survival we are selecting for these tall, long giraffes. So you do need to memorize the words disruptive, stabilizing, and directional.
The third mechanism is speciation, and this is the development of a new species. This can occur because of geographic isolation. This is where part of your population becomes separated by distance, and then the species or population will evolve differently, leading to the new species.
And so a really great example of this is the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon didn't always exist. It's actually a dried up river, so there was water rushing through, carving out the earth, and then eventually that river dried up and we were left with the Grand Canyon. Well, this always reminds me of the movie Land Before Time. Do you remember Littlefoot and Sarah and Petrie and Spike and the dinosaurs that got separated from the rest, and then they had to find their way back? And so if you got separated and you never found your way back, you were always separate, your environments might be a little different. So surviving on the right side of the Grand Canyon might mean one thing, whereas surviving on the left side means another thing. And the idea being that if the environments are different, different organisms are going to survive, and sometimes will be so different that we can no longer mate. So if you're a new species, you actually can no longer mate. And you can see that in the scientific names of these two species. They have the same first name, which we'll learn is called the genus. Their second name, their species name, is different. So even though they're both squirrels, that's what these are, both squirrels, they can't mate. And we could talk a little bit about why, like maybe they're ready to mate at different times of the year, maybe they just never run into each other, maybe their parts are a little different now. Think of examples, some types of dogs could probably never mate. And so if you can no longer mate, you're now new species. And all that really means is giving you a different name.
So then we have two types of time frames for evolution as well. A time frame is going to describe how quickly the new species may have formed based on the fossil record. The first time frame is called gradualism. This is where you have small changes occurring constantly until a new species is formed.
And so we do want to focus on the word gradual, which means like slowly over time. So we don't see any dramatic changes, and this picture is really helpful because it kind of shows you that when this butterfly reproduced, there were some slight mutations. And as this butterfly continued reproducing, it accumulated its own set of mutations. When this butterfly continued reproducing, we acquired a different set of mutations. And so the time frame that it happens If we're seeing slow accumulation of changes, a little bit here and a little bit there, that's called gradualism.
And the second time frame is called punctuated equilibrium. So you have a long period of no change that's followed by a period of very rapid change. And that's going to lead to your new species.
The thing we want to add is this idea of punctuated equilibrium. Equal meaning like long period of no change. Punctuate means like to pause or to restart. And so punctuate equilibrium, if we break that word down, it kind of makes sense. No change and then a quick change. We want to add that this is sometimes the idea of natural disasters. So sometimes you'll have a group of organisms and there's really not a lot of evolution going on at all. If there's a natural disaster and only some of them survive, sometimes we see a quick change in the fossil record because only those organisms survive. And that's as far as we're going today.